In early 21st century America, cemeteries they're getting harder to find. Drive through almost any city built in the last, say, 60 years or so, and you probably won't even see one. If you do, it's probably old, built 100 years or more ago, and the city, like here, just grew up around it. But if you travel to older cities here or around the world, cemeteries, tombs, and other places for the dead they're everywhere. Places like this were part of the culture and the architectural landscape wherever people lived, from country villages to great metropolises. In fact, in older cities, they've become landmarks, part of the visual texture of the past. In some cases, even tourist destinations. For almost every civilization before ours, and even in ours until just a few decades ago, the dead were always visible. They were remembered. For thousands of years, Christians visited their dead, whether it was in the catacombs of Rome or in parish churchyards. The dead were with us. They were part of our community. But today, in our culture, when people pass, they just go away. Our neighbors, our loved ones, they're disposed of with dignity for sure, but they're disposed of discreetly. In our culture, death and the dead have become almost invisible. Now, there are probably some really good reasons for that. Burial, truthfully, has become very expensive. Although, one wonders whether it's really relatively more expensive today than it was in the past for the families who buried their loved ones here, for example. And we can only speculate on the cost of death and the cost of burying the dead compared to the things we spend on the things of this life. I suspect that disappearance of the dead in our culture has more to do with our perspective on funerals than their real cost. And I suspect that has a lot to do with our perspective on the body. For thousands of years, Christians believed that humans were a fusion of body and soul. And so they believed that while the soul is departed, the body remains, awaiting their reunion in the resurrection. That's why Christians visited the catacombs and cemeteries to visit the remains of their loved ones, to pray for their souls, and to look forward with hope to the day when we are all reunited again. But now, our culture sees the body as a vehicle for the mind, as a suit of clothes for the soul, as a shell that we shed like a hermit crab, or a cocoon that we leave behind to wither after we're set free. And this change in perspective about human life, about death and the dead, about souls and bodies, is why modern Christians have such a hard time, I think, understanding something that Christians have practiced since the first disciples treasured the burial cloth of Christ. And that was venerating the relics of the saints. I'm Greg Smith, and over the next year I'll be your guide around the world and back and forth through the ages as we discover the Catholic story and how the Church has preserved the faith once and for all given to the saints. Welcome to episode 15 of One Rolling Adventure. Tonight, we're going to take on a topic that to my Protestant or modern secularist friends, or even some Catholics that have been influenced by those worldviews, is a bit controversial, a bit bizarre, and maybe even just a bit offensive.
You see, to the Protestant or the modernist mind, sacred relics, meaning the bodies or pieces of the bodies of martyrs and saints, or objects that they touched or that were related to their martyrdom, like the spear of Longinus that pierced Jesus' side on the cross. All of these are sort of an absurd concept. And they were going back to the Protestant reformers like Martin Luther or John Calvin or to the Enlightenment thinkers that followed them. That mindset found it offensive, still finds it offensive, that Catholics would, worship these relics. Now, when one explains that Catholics don't, in fact, worship them, but only venerate them, well, it doesn't do much to diffuse their skepticism. You see, they don't understand or recognize that distinction, and most Catholics, frankly, don't do a very good job of explaining the distinction. So it just becomes a point of confusion and division between everybody. And if you sort of buy into the assumptions of the Protestant modernist worldview, not to mention the culture of the United States and Canada, which were founded on them, the Catholic use of relics does seem, kind of weird. And from that perspective, we must admit that some relics can seem a little weirder than others. Already within the first generations of the church, Christians honored the tombs of their dead martyrs and saints and objects associated with them, beginning with the apostles. There's all kinds of accounts in the early church about keeping, objects associated with the apostles, and in the first generation of church, finding where the apostles were buried or various saints were buried and honoring their tombs. People going there to pray and whatnot, and the various objects associated, say, with the crucifixion, objects associated with Peter or Paul. People were treasuring those things, and it made a lot of sense for them to do that. Now, all around Rome to this day, you go visit them, and there are catacombs. There's dozens of sets of catacombs spread around Rome, and these are literally caves or networks of caves dug into the limestone in which are buried thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christians. And Christians were going down to the catacombs from the first generations to visit their dead, to pray, to pray for them, to have masses. You can go down and see in some of the catacomb spaces where they would hold, worship services and prayer services, and they would take down, flowers and candles and various kinds of things to commemorate their dead in the catacombs. In fact, St. Peter's Basilica, and particularly its altar, is located exactly over the tomb of Peter. Peter was crucified in what is now the location of St. Peter's Square, and he was taken across the street after his execution and buried in a public cemetery in a tomb. The tombs were largely sort of above ground in that space because it was sort of marshy ground. And shortly afterwards, of course, all of the Christian community in the Rome area knew that, may have witnessed Peter being crucified, and they visited his tomb there. And they would go out there and pray and hold services and masses. And in fact, when they excavated Peter's tomb many years later, they situated the old St. Peter's and the new St. Peter's and the altar directly over it. But when that was excavated around World War II, they found on the side of the tomb underneath it, 70 feet below the altar, graffiti scratched into the side of the tomb that says, "Peter is here," and evidence that people were visiting it, immediately. In fact, I've had the privilege of going down and seeing that on 2 separate occasions. So that continued because under churches, and especially the ancient churches all around the world, and in fact, that continued until very recent times when our sort of modernist sense of architecture changed, and we began to strip our churches of their history. All around the old churches of the ancient world are tombs of martyrs and saints, and in many cases, simply members of the church who wanted to be buried in the church. And these tombs and relics inside these churches are places of prayer and reflection and devotion. In fact, one of the glories, one of the most wonderful things about traveling to the great Catholic churches and cathedrals and basilicas all around the world are all the wonderful side chapels and side altars that you discover dedicated to various martyrs and saints, particularly local martyrs and saints. And going underneath those, in many cases, those basilicas and those churches and those cathedrals to see the crypts and tombs of martyrs and saints. When we go there, they help us feel, I think, the continuity of the church over the ages. It reminds us that we are connected in community to the great, cloud of witnesses that has come before us. And when you visit those churches, in addition to the tombs and crypts, they're often reliquaries. Now, a reliquary is a small case or container that holds a relic. And sometimes these are just simply small cases containing perhaps a sliver of a saint's body, like a bone or a holy object. And sometimes there are these larger containers, like the size of a trunk, or actually in some ways reminiscent of the Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament that contained, of course, objects related to the Exodus. Now, to visit these amazing places and kneel before these amazing objects is deeply moving when you have the opportunity to do that. It's an opportunity, like as I said, to pray and reflect and renew your devotion. I'll never forget the time that I was in Rome, and for one of the first times, and we went to Trastevere, which is a section of Rome over the Tiber River from central Rome, and we visited the Basilica of Saint Cecilia, and the wonderful sort of relic of her tomb there, the reliquary and crypt of her tomb was very, very moving, especially for me as a new Catholic at the time to see that and the way it was presented, and it was a deep connection to that great martyr. But in any case, all of these tombs and relics and altars, over time, they accumulated inside these great churches, layer upon layer, branch upon branch, facets and dimensions always being added to the story of the church, such that when you go into some of these wonderful old churches or cathedrals or basilicas, they're chock full of all of these accoutrements and altars and side chapels and crypts and art. And it becomes this wonderful reminder that the church is so much bigger than we are. And it's so much bigger than just our generation. It humbles you. It brings you in humility, sort of before all those who've gone before us and all of those who've modeled for us what devotion to Christ means. Now, some relics can strike non-Catholics, though, as just downright weird and bizarre and even gross. I have Protestant friends that, when you mention to them that in the one of the piers in the central around the central altar in St. Peter's is supposedly the spear of Longinus that pierced Christ's side, I even have Protestant friends that think that's pretty cool. But when you see some of the relics that have been collected over the years, Protestants and modernist Catholics and secular people think, wow, that's just so kind of creepy and weird and gross. Well, for example, outside Turin, Italy, is a church dedicated to St. John Bosco. Wonderful altar, beautiful memorials to St. John Bosco, and it's great to remember this great saint and his accomplishments. But next to his altar is a reliquary containing the brain of St. John Bosco. And you look through the glass and, well, there it is. It's like a really old, shriveled brain. Now, again, that's deeply moving when you think about this as the brain, and we'll talk more about why we commemorate these things later in the episode, but that this is the brain of this great saint, and it's a way to touch him in the past. But the thought of just sort of looking at his shriveled old brain, well, like I said, some people find that a little weird. Also in Italy, you can visit the heart tissue of St. Philip Neri. St. Philip Neri was an amazing saint, a wonderful man who accomplished so much for the kingdom and for the church. But in this reliquary is his heart. After he died, they extracted it and they sort of shaped the heart tissue and they put it in here. See, it even looks like a little bit, they shaped it to look like the symbol of a heart. And, you can go and see it. In Bavaria, which is the portion of Germany that's most Catholic, are a number of skeletons of saints that have been, bejeweled inside glass coffins, like Saint Hyacinth of Caesarea and Saint Clemens. It's quite something to see those. Now, on the coast of Greece stands the imposing Mount Athos, and on Mount Athos is a famous Orthodox monastery. It's one of the oldest and most prestigious monasteries in all of Christendom. And the monastery at St. Athos contains the head of St. John Chrysostom. Now, what's interesting is that one of St. John Chrysostom's ears is uncorrupted, meaning that it hasn't sort of decayed. And you can see it through the hole in the reliquary. See how the skull is oriented with the ear sort of hanging out or visible. And the monks of St. Athos bring the reliquary with the skull and the exposed ear out on feast days and process around with it. St. Oliver Plunkett was an Irish bishop murdered by English Protestants in the midst of a lot of the Protestant-Irish conflict on that island. And in Drogheda, you can still visit not only the shrine of St. Oliver Plunkett, but his head, which is displayed in a reliquary there. And we have to admit, it's not a pretty head. In fact, most people find the head pretty gross looking. But there it is, the head of St. Oliver Plunkett. Now, over the centuries, reliquaries have been developed for various types of relics, like specialized forms of reliquaries. For example, there are foot reliquaries that contain, as you probably guessed it, bones from the feet of a saint or of a saint's foot, like the foot bones of St. Blaise, or the foot bones of St. James, or the foot bones of St. Margaret. And you can see in her reliquary this little cavity that opens in the back where the relic went. Now, the worldview that gave rise to these kinds of relics had or has a very different attitude toward the body and church history. In that worldview, the human body, isn't something to be hidden when it passes away. It was something to be celebrated and memorialized, even then when there wasn't still a physical relic associated with it. So, for an example of something that seems really weird to modern people, consider St. Agatha of Sicily. Now, Sicily is the island that looks like a soccer ball that the boot of Italy is kicking. St. Agatha was a young Christian woman in the Sicilian city of Catania during the centuries of persecution under the Roman Empire. She is a martyr who was tortured by the Romans by having her breasts cut off before she was executed. Since then, she was memorialized in Catholic Christian art, especially in Sicily, by paintings depicting her with her breasts on a tray. In effect, the painting was telling her story and demonstrating that she offered up the evidence of her martyrdom to Christ. But the Sicilians didn't stop there. For centuries, they have cooked special cakes on her feast day called, you guessed it, St. Agatha's breasts. Those are little maraschino cherries on the top. I've never tried them, but I have to admit they look pretty tasty. Now, this entire attitude toward death and the body is profoundly Catholic, and it's rooted in the culture of the early church, which had a lot to do with the Latin and Greek culture of the ancient world. In North America, the Protestant Reformation and the founding of America and Canada by the English and by English Protestants make this whole worldview seem, I think, alien to us. But in Catholic countries with Latin roots, It's an integral part of the culture. Consider the celebration in Mexico of the Day of the Dead, celebrated in conjunction with All Souls and All Saints' Day feasts. It's a celebration of those who have died with an attitude toward their remains that is kind of shocking to American Protestants, including skulls and candles and candy. But it is, in fact, a celebration of those who have come before and not being afraid of death, knowing that death is not an end and our remains not an end, and wanting to celebrate that the dead are still with us and still part of our community. A profoundly sort of Latin Catholic Christian worldview that, again, shocks, I think, the sort of English Protestant secularist mind. Or consider the predominantly Catholic nation of Rwanda in Africa. In the 1990s, there was a terrible civil war in Rwanda that resulted in a genocide. People were murdered in churches, and churches were burned, and bodies were everywhere. Well, today in Rwanda, there are memorials to this genocide that preserve not only the destroyed churches, but the remains of those who died. These things are not hidden, but they're in the open. They're remembered and they're memorialized. If anything, the shock of many Protestants, particularly in North America, reflects, I think, a disconnect from how death has been, remembered and commemorated around the world, throughout history, not only in Catholicism, but in other cultures. The ancient world was, of course, full of relics and memorials to the dead. What comes to mind first for many of us, of course, are the tombs of the pharaohs of Egypt. But this instinct in mankind has been nearly universal. And in other religions. Around Asia, you can visit relics of the Buddha. Muslims visit relics of Muhammad, including his beard, tooth, footprints, and sword. And our secularist culture has transferred this instinct to our saints, entertainers, and athletes. Consider the pilgrimages made to the homes of movie stars, or to the crosswalk of Abbey Road in London, to the incredible money paid in auctions for movie or music or sports memorabilia. You see, all of this speaks to, I think, a deep instinct. Actually, I would call it a deep awareness that objects, things connect us to the past and to important people in the past, and that in some real ways, that connection is helpful as we seek to navigate the present and reach toward the future. So, there are so many misunderstandings about relics, but what does the Catholic Church actually teach about it? What is the official doctrine and practice? Well, the best place to begin answering any question about what the Catholic Church teaches about any topic is with the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the official compendium of all the Church's teachings about, every doctrine and topic. So when we go to the Catechism of the Catholic Church to understand the teaching on relics, we have to go to the section of the Catechism that is about the celebration of the Christian mystery. In particular, there's a section in there called the Seven Sacraments of the Church. After that, there's a section called Other Liturgical Celebrations, other ways that the Church celebrates the central Christian mystery of the gospel. And in that section, we come on a segment that is about the topic of sacramentals. Now, what is a sacramental? It sounds like sacrament, but they're not the same thing. Here's what the Church says. Holy Mother Church has, moreover, instituted sacramentals. Sacramentals are sacred signs that are instituted by the Church. They signify effects, particularly of a spiritual nature, which are obtained through the intercession of the Church. They prepare men to receive the fruit of the sacraments and sanctify different circumstances in life. You see, sacramentals are instituted for the sanctification of certain ministries of the Church, certain states of life, the Catechism says, a great variety of circumstances in Christian life, and the use of many things that are helpful to man. So, while not the same as the sacraments, which are means of grace, Sacramentals are sort of supplemental things that don't transfer grace to us. They don't save us in any way, but they're helpful in our spiritual growth, or they're helpful in our devotion. They're helpful as we try to grow and follow Jesus Christ by giving us sort of anchor points, things that we can focus our devotion on. The Catechism says that in accordance with bishops' pastoral decisions, they can also respond to the needs, the culture, and special history of the Christian people of a particular region or time. So, as we look back in history and we see that in the early church, people were going to the catacombs, or they were treasuring, the tomb of Peter or other objects of the apostles or Christ, the church was able to see that this was helpful for people to be able to focus their devotion and grow. Today, in Latin cultures like Mexico or Rwanda, there are ways that people sort of grapple with death, grapple with the reality of loved ones that have been left behind. Now, the church isn't baptizing, folk religion or superstition, but it's recognizing that within cultures there are things that are anchor points, or things that are rungs on a ladder, or things that make sense within a particular cultural context that can be points of focus and devotion and reflection and prayer that help people to grow. So we got to be really clear here. Sacramentals do not, say it for anybody who's listening to this, especially my Protestant friends. Sacramentals do not confer the grace of the Holy Spirit in the same way that the sacraments do, But the Catechism teaches us, by the church's prayer, they prepare us to receive grace and dispose us to cooperate with it. So, for example, sacramentals include things like blessings. They include things like making the sign of the cross. They include things like kneeling for prayer. You see, these things don't save us, and nobody pretends that they do. But in receiving a blessing, in making the sign of the cross before or after prayer, and in kneeling to pray, we have a means of sort of focusing our devotion and making our devotion real. They, again, don't save us. They aren't means of grace, but they cooperate and facilitate and help us as we try to live our Christian life. And they're helpful through daily life because they connect us to the mystery of the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. So it is from the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ that all sacramentals draw their power. All the sacraments draw their power. They don't have power in and of themselves. That power is a connection to the sacrifice, the death, the resurrection of Christ, and the power that proceeds from that. There is scarcely any proper use of material things, the Catechism says, which cannot be thus directed toward the sanctification of men and the praise of God. Think about worshiping with music and musical instruments or art. Those are all things that, even for Protestants, help them to focus their devotion. When I was a Protestant and a Protestant pastor, we talked frequently about how the musical portions of our worship service or church architecture or certain kinds of things that we do helped people, we said, enter into the presence of Christ. Well, that's what the sacramentals are. They're things that help us to manifest the presence of Christ in real and practical ways in our life and in our worship. Now, the Catechism goes on to say that the religious sense of the Christian people has always found expression in various forms of piety surrounding the church's sacramental life, such as the veneration of relics, such as the visits to sanctuaries, such as pilgrimages to holy places, such as processions, such as doing the Stations of the Cross, such as the Rosary, such as saints' medals like I'm wearing right here. The Catechism says that these expressions of piety extend the liturgical life of the church, but do not replace it. The Catechism says that they should be so drawn up that they harmonize with the liturgical seasons in accordance with the sacred liturgy, because they're in some ways derived from it, and they lead people to it. Since in fact the liturgy is by very its nature superior to the sacramentals themselves. So, perfect example of this is when I'm recording this, we're just about to go into Lent. Well, there are certain practices that we do during Lent. They're not sacraments, and they don't save us, like the Stations of the Cross. The Stations of the Cross is a wonderful thing to do to focus our devotion during the Lenten season, but it's not a sacrament. It's a sacramental. Now, the Catechism goes on to say that pastoral discernment is needed to sustain and support popular piety. Okay? So, popular people might adopt practices, well-intentioned practices that begin to become maybe theologically or doctrinally a little questionable. And so the Catechism says that if necessary, bishops should purify and correct the religious sense which underlies these devotions, so that the faithful may advance in knowledge of the mystery of Christ. So in the past, when maybe there are abuses of sacramentals, or in the future if there are abuses of sacramentals, the bishops need to step up and say, the instinct might be right, but the practice is leading people a little bit astray. The Catechism says that the exercise of the sacramentals is subject to the care and judgment of the bishops and to the general norms of the Church. I think this is such an important point because when you go back to Martin Luther and John Calvin and the Reformers, they like to point out all of the abuses of relics, all the abuses of the sacramentals. And no doubt people did abuse them, just like people are going to abuse anything. People are going to misunderstand, get confused, fall into error. But the Church says it's not that, doing the Stations of the Cross or making a pilgrimage or venerating visiting the tomb of an apostle or a saint is in and of itself a bad thing. Of course, people can misuse that, and that it's the responsibility of the Church to sort of shepherd and guide their instincts and devotions in a healthy way and steer them away from those things which have, sort of trended into being unhealthy. A perfect example of how the abuses of sacramentals and relics in the past was corrected, and the place where we find the most specific teaching of the Catholic Church with regard to the veneration of relics is in a decree of the Council of Trent. Now, the Council of Trent was the Church's response to the Protestant Reformation and to the objections of Protestant theologians like Luther and Calvin to what they saw as abuses of the Church. So the Church gathered and looked at its practices, evaluated them in the light of the Reformers' critiques, and affirmed, the core of Catholic teaching while correcting some of the abuses. The Council of Trent instructed bishops and other pastors to instruct their flocks that the bodies of holy martyrs and others now living in Christ, which bodies were the living members of Christ and the temple of the Holy Ghost, and which by him are to be raised to eternal life and glorified on the last day, are to be venerated properly and in the proper way by the faithful. But, the Council of Trent said, the benefits that come from paying honor to these saints is not due to the relic itself. Relics aren't magic objects. In fact, the council said that honoring relics or visiting the tombs of the saints in the belief that these have power in themselves is vain and I quote, is to be wholly condemned, as the Church has already long since condemned and also now condemns. So, when the Reformers or Protestants today point to egregious abuses of relics, the proper response is, yeah, those are egregious abuses, and the Church condemns egregious abuses. Let me pause here to say that I covered this point at great length in episode 2 of One Warlike Adventure on the topic of icons and holy images. In that episode, I explained that St. Thomas Aquinas and other doctors of the Church have clearly pointed out that icons, images, and relics do not have power in themselves, but are conduits that connect us to the power of grace in Christ and the saints in heaven, and that the honor we pay to the visible object passes through that object to the thing it represents. So, if you haven't watched that episode, you might find it helpful, since the same principle is at work here with relics. Now, the Council of Trent went on to say, in response to both the Protestant reformers and the abuses that they were reacting to, that, quote, in the invocation of saints and the veneration of relics and the sacred use of images, every superstition shall be removed, and all filthy profiting by sale of such items shall be abolished. So, again, I talk to my Protestant friends who'll say, well, Martin Luther and John Calvin pointed out that, there were bad people in the Middle Ages who were sort of selling relics and abusing them. And you go, yeah, they were selling relics and abusing them in some cases, and that was wrong. And the church has condemned it, and the church condemns it to this day, just like, any organization condemns abuses. It's not Catholic teaching. And that, the council went on to say, the visitation of relics must not by any be perverted into revelings and drunkenness. That was another complaint of Luther's, that people would go on these pilgrimages, or they would go visit some cathedral to visit a relic, and then they would turn into a drunken party. And of course, the church said, yeah, to the extent that anybody does that, what they're doing is wrong, and we condemn it. Now, the council goes on to say that to prevent abuses like that, no new miracles are to be acknowledged or new relics recognized unless the bishop of the diocese has taken cognizance of and approved it. So, in other words, what they were trying to stamp out were these sort of folk cults where they had maybe some local hero that they were elevating to sort of a canonical saint status and visiting their relics. What the Council of Trent said and what the church said is that the canonization of saints and the acknowledgement of relics needs to be controlled very carefully and very diligently and with great integrity by the church. It says that the bishop in all these matters is directed to obtain accurate information and to take counsel with theologians and pious people, and in cases of doubt or exceptional difficulty, to submit the matter to higher authorities in the church, so that nothing new or that has previously not been usual in the church shall be resolved on without first consulting the Holy See. So in other words, you can't have these sort of folk cults popping up worshiping saints who aren't really saints, or worshiping relics that aren't legitimate relics. Well, since the Council of Trent, the church has followed through on that. So there is actually a process in the Vatican for recognizing relics and the legitimacy of relics and classifying them. The Vatican department in charge of this is the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, and they have rules and documents about this, and those were updated in 2017. So the latest version of the sort of rules of the Congregation of the Causes of the Saints for the acknowledgement of relics is a document called Relics in the Church, Authenticity and Preservation. You can find it on the Vatican website, circa 2017. Now, if you do an internet search on relics, what you may read is that there are three classes of relics: first-class relics, second-class relics, third-class relics. First-class relics are supposed to be the complete body of a saint. Second-class relics are some part of their body. Third-class relics, it says, are objects that were important to the saint or the saint touched. Actually, in 2017, this document by the Congregation of the Saints updates that language. It talks about the bodies of the blesseds and of the saints, or notable parts of their bodies, like the heart of St. John Bosco, or the head of St. Catherine, or something like that, are considered significant relics. And it says it has a very detailed process for validating whether these relics are authentic and regulating their care and their vigilance in preserving them, and veneration to prevent and avoid and prevent any abuses. And so therefore they are preserved in properly sealed containers. They're kept in places that guarantee their safety. They're treated with great respect, and not abused in any way. And it's pretty tightly regulated. It says, though, that little fragments of the body, so a sliver of bone or whatnot of the blesseds and of the saints, as well as objects that have come into direct contact with their person, are considered non-significant relics. And if possible, they also are to be preserved in sealed cases, and honored with the proper spirit, and avoiding every type, it says, of superstition and illicit trade. Now, a little known aspect to how relics are utilized in the church, I mean, recognize the big reliquaries and the tombs and some of these things. And most Catholics don't even know this, but that every Catholic altar has a relic in it, or in many cases, actually two relics. So in every Catholic altar, by canon law, there is a small square or oblong chamber in the body of the altar, like a little cavity. It's called an altar cavity or a sepulchrum, in which are placed, according to canon law, the relics of two canonized martyrs. Okay? Remember that. Remember martyrs. So every Catholic altar, somewhere in it when it was built, because a Catholic altar is supposed to be stone of some sort, there is a little cavity, often very small, and in that little cavity are the altars of the relics of two canonized martyrs, and often very small relics. Now, remember that. And then, of course, my Protestant friends would say, why? That just seems crazy. In fact, any Protestant friends that are listening to this are howling at this point, and their response is, where is this nonsense, this Catholic nonsense in the Bible? And my response is, more about Catholic liturgy is biblical than they think. You know, I didn't realize a lot of this, and when I began to study it, it's why I became Catholic. Because in fact, everything in Catholic liturgy has biblical references. Catholic liturgy is meant not only to reflect the holy liturgy of the Old Testament, which was itself a foreshadowing of the life and death and resurrection of Christ, and not only to reflect the lives of the early apostles, but to resemble the perfect heavenly liturgy of which all of that was a foreshadowing. So, in Revelation chapter 6, verse 9, St. John records that when he opened the fifth seal, when Christ opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar, which is in the throne room of God, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony that they maintained. So, just to cash that out, when St. John is given a vision of the heavenly throne room of God and the worship that occurs there, he sees that underneath the altar there are the souls of the martyrs. And so, in Catholic liturgy, resembling the heavenly liturgy as described in Revelation, is conducted on an altar which literally has martyrs underneath it. You know, it's another reason that we venerate the altar in a Catholic Church by kneeling, bowing, and the priest kissing it. Because it is not only the site of the sacrifice of Christ, but of the repository of the relics of martyrs, just as in the worship around the throne of God, as described in the book of Revelation. Canon law goes on to stipulate that these relics must be actual portions of the saints' bodies, not simply of their garments or of other objects which they may have used or touched. The relics have to be actual pieces of the body, and there needs to be at least two of them, because in plural, there are martyrs, the bodies, the relics of martyrs are in the altar, just as in the book of Revelation. And the relics must, of course, be authenticated in the ways that we described by the Vatican. Now it goes on to say in canon law that these relics are placed in this sepulchrum or altar cavity, and that has to be lined with lead, silver, or gold. And it, obviously needs to be large enough to contain not only the relics, but this is interesting, 3 grains of incense. Okay? Because in that description of Revelation, not only are the souls of the martyrs underneath the altar, but the prayers of the saints go up from the altar. And so in Catholic altars, there are the relics of martyrs and 3 grains of incense representing the Trinity, which represents the prayers of the saints going up before the altar. It also specifies in canon law that a small piece of parchment on which is written an attestation of the consecration needs to be in that altar cavity, that sepulchrum. So a little slip of paper that describes who the saints are and witnesses to the consecration of that altar by a Catholic bishop. Now, all of this parchment and everything else, is usually enclosed in a crystal vessel or a small vial to prevent the parchment from decomposing. And this cavity, canon law specifies, must be hewn in the natural stone of the altar. It can't be like bolted on. It actually has to be cut into the natural stone of the altar and centered right into it. So in the sort of the center of the center mass, the center of the mass, right in the center of the mass of the altar is these sacred relics. And it also says that the cover of this altar cavity sepulchrum must have a cross engraved on the upper and nether sides. Again, this gives, I think, some context to how and why we show honor to Catholic altars and why they need to be consecrated by a bishop and how we behave towards them when we enter a sanctuary space.
Venerating relics of the saints isn't Catholic superstition or mumbo-jumbo. It's rooted in, and a proclamation of, key doctrines of the Christian faith. First, relics remind us that the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ has purchased everlasting life for his disciples. We are saved by faith, and we manifest that faith with obedience, participation in the sacraments, witness, and good works. And because of that, we shall not perish, but have eternal life. St. Paul said that the world competes for perishable things, but we strive for the imperishable. And relics remind us that those who have fought the fight, who've run the race and have kept the faith, have received the crown of life. Second, relics remind us that we are a fusion of body and soul. As the old theologians called it, a hypostatic union. Death is a temporary severing of our being. And while the soul is departed for a while, the remains remind us that Christ has risen, the first fruits of a great resurrection of all persons on the last day. The body is not a used car taken to the scrapyard or a suit of clothes dropped off at a recycling center. It is what remains of a saint until that saint rises again and Christ makes all things new. Third, relics remind us that the human body is sacred because human life is sacred because it's made in the image of God. The body is the incarnation of God's image in the material universe. God the Father does not have a body, but in Jesus Christ he was incarnated. God became a man, and showing reverence for the remains of the saints shows respect for the permanence of the image of God in us. And fourth, relics remind us that we are part of a great community of saints, past and present. Departed saints are a great cloud of witnesses, not only rejoicing before God as they await the resurrection, but interceding for us. Their prayers are like incense going up before his throne. Treasuring their remains connects us to them, what the old writers used to call the church militant reaching toward the church triumphant, asking for prayer. You know, in a time when essential Christian beliefs are forgotten or distorted, in a time when our heritage is being erased and replaced with materialism and consumerism and a new sort of Gnosticism, relics of the saints are a treasury of the faith that we should rediscover and take deep comfort in.